this week we have with us the science fiction and fantasy author Martha Wells, who ironically is the fourth female writer we've ever had on the show, which is something we definitely need to fix. But Martha Wells comes from Texas and is known for creating detailed societies in her novels and fantasy, which she also sometimes writes nonfiction essays on fantasy and sci-fi subjects. So welcome to the show, Martha Wells.
Oh,
or
thanks
would
for
you
having me.
called Martha? Would you prefer Martha or just Miss Wells?
Yeah, Martha is fine.
Okay. So we're going to start with an early question, because one of our listeners wants to know, so you have a bachelor's in anthropology, and you just want to know, how come so many authors who write in fantasy and science fiction don't have English degrees? Instead, they have degrees in science, in social sciences, in history, and all these other places. All these authors, especially all the Star Wars ones that most people know of, have other interests or other degrees, and yet they write such amazing, detailed things. Do you have any idea why these just aren't the English degrees that are writing all these great worlds?
Well, I think that when you want to write science fiction and fantasy, you've read a lot of it, and it probably just engenders an interest in other things. You kind of want to explore the world. I know if you like science fiction a lot, you're probably curious about science and interested in that. If you're curious about people, you want to learn more about people. I think it's probably that.
Okay, so when you got your degree in anthropology, were you intending to also start writing, or were you intending to go in a different direction and writing just found you?
I wanted to be a writer for a long time, since I was probably in high school or middle school. I always kind of tried to write little stories for myself. I wrote Godzilla fanfic when I was in elementary school. I'd always had a lot of fun with it, and I'd always been a big reader. So I chose anthropology because I was interested in it. But I think in my heart, I really did want to be a full-time writer. So I knew that was difficult, though, and I knew I was probably going to need to have another job.
Okay. And, one thing I've definitely noticed in your novels, and from the people's praise of your novels, is that they bring in that you can write very detailed societies and very detailed the way people work, which is something you get directly from anthropology. Is there any specific, say, if you hear noise in the background, that's my son. He's out here just talking to mommy. Do you have any specific like civilizations or people that you like to draw from, or do you like continue to doing your research about different civilizations and cultures and just draw them into your novels as you write?
Yeah, I like to just research a broad variety, because I think that really helps you create your own. Basically, I find it very difficult to create a city or a culture without kind of knowing how real world ones work. So that helps. And once you kind of internalize that, you're mostly just looking for the way people deal with different landscapes, different levels of technology, and kind of trying to extrapolate technology. So yeah, I just deal with I like a broad range, because I think that's also very inspiring and lets you think of going into different areas. Let me try to find a better way to phrase that. Well, you're looking at, especially trying to work on fantasy environments, coming up with strange places people could live and thinking about how they would adapt to them. That's very interesting and inspiring.
I grew up reading a lot of David Eddings' books when I was younger. And, a lot of his civilizations, like he has, I don't know if you know, like the Belgariad Mandalorian, but he has like the Revan Codex, which goes over the civilization. And that helps so much to be able to see how they function, while you have other authors that focus more on the fantastical versus the civilization. But the ones I go back to are like the Tolkiens and the Eddings and so on, who you know how their society works, and so you can get involved into it so much more, because you know how to stick yourself in there because you know how it works.
Yeah, and even really fantastical societies that would not really function in any kind of real-world environment also have to be internally consistent, because that's what really throws the reader out. If they just hit something that they know, not necessarily something that they know wouldn't work, but something that is sort of at odds with the way the rest of the world works, and kind of sticks out there that it doesn't belong there, and it isn't it isn't part of the world.
Agreed. And your books are definitely ones that are very, very strong in the society side. And you write a variety of things. You write young adult, you write adult, you've written science fiction, you write fantasy, you write nonfiction essays on fantasy and science fiction subjects that have been translated in a lot of different things. What got you to want to write the more essay side of fantasy and science fiction to get involved? This is something I think I've seen others like, say, Orson Scott Card, I think, does a lot of these as well. What got you to want to write the more nonfiction side of fiction, I guess?
Well, basically, I've been invited to a couple of nonfiction anthologies, a few of those, and so that's when I started writing them. I like to write mostly for my those kind of things for my journal or my blog, and it's just fun to talk about that kind of thing and, discuss it with readers, and it kind of helps you, I think, crystallize your own thoughts a little bit better when you write about what you liked about other people's worlds or books and kind of what's interesting for you.
I know one of the essays I believe you wrote Neville Longbottom, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, right?
Yes.
Okay, where you mapped out how Neville, if I recall this one right, this is the one that basically maps out the theory, which was definitely in the novels by J.K. Rowling, that Neville could have been Harry Potter, but at the same time was also a hero just like Harry Potter, and the different aspects of a hero that he had.
Yeah, and I actually wrote that before she made that part of the books. I mean, it was kind of in there all along. That's what a lot of people were reacting to. So, but there wasn't any confirmation on it at the point where I wrote that. So that was kind of fun to be right about it.
Huh. So where did you? So that means you wrote this around before book 5 came out. I believe that's when she started. Really.
I think that was. It was for a anthology, a nonfiction anthology. That let's see, got this on here. That was back in 2000. It came out in 2006. I would have written it around 2005.
Okay, so right after book 4 came out. So what drew you to Neville Longbottom in the first 4 books, where most people, especially those who actually went to the movies instead, they didn't do as much in the movies as the books, where he was mostly a kind of a buffoon, or not really buffoon, clumsy, eccentric.
In the books, he's really an underdog. And I always just had a lot of sympathy for him because, Harry's kind of an underdog too, but Neville is the one that, he's made fun of by the other kids. He's really at a disadvantage. He's shy. He doesn't, it takes him a while to kind of get into the group with the others. So I just always liked him because of that.
And, people can still actually find your writing. I believe Mercedes Lackey actually did a lot with that. I believe edited that whole set, right?
Yeah, she's the editor. It's for Ben Bella Books, and it's still available in paperback and ebook. So pretty easy to find.
And I believe you also did some essays involving Farscape. You did one in the Kobold Guide to Magic somewhat recently. So why fantasy? What drew you to fantasy? Were there specific authors or books growing up that you read? Sometimes even movies. What drew you to want to write the fantastical?
I really don't know. I just always liked it. When I was a little kid, like one of the books I learned to read on was The Time Machine, because it had, our name on it on the cover. We had an old paperback copy of it. And I just always liked that. And I liked children's books that I would find at the library that were more on the fantasy and science fiction side. And also in that library, they hadn't put really a divider between the children's books and the adult science fiction. So instead of sort of making the turn into the rest of the children's section, I kept going along the wall to where the adult science fiction was. So I read a lot of books that were probably over my head when I was too young for them. I really enjoyed them, and I just always liked it. I always loved back then there was only like 5 TV channels, and we had one independent station in Fort Worth that showed old science, Irwin Allen science fiction series and movies and every Saturday, and I just always really loved that. So I'm not really sure if there's any one incident that made me like science fiction and fantasy. It was just always something that was there and something I enjoyed.
I do find it amusing that you were drawn to H.G. Wells because of your name. Because when I was, just asking around for questions for you, one person was like, "Oh, you have H.G. Wells on." I'm like, "No, H.G. Wells is no." And she's like, "Well, H.G. stands for something, doesn't it? It could be Martha." I'm like, "No, it doesn't."
No.
And the person was excited at first and confused because they thought H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds for Spielberg, and I had to correct them that book is a lot older than Spielberg's Tom Cruise movie.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start diving into some listener questions. This first one, he works with a lot of authors and publishers, and he wants to know, because this is happening in his life right now, what happens to an author's books when their publisher folds? Are the books with the publisher republished once the author gets the rights back, or are those books in limbo, or does it depend?
It really depends on usually if a publisher folds, the books are going to go out of print pretty quickly. And usually in contracts, there's a clause that says if the book has been out of print for a certain length of time, the rights can be returned to the author. It depends if the publisher is still there for someone to, that's getting confusing. Let me not get into that. But basically it depends on what the contract says about the rights going out of print, and a lot of them will have language in there for what happens specifically if the publisher does fold. So usually...
So books don't usually just disappear and hold in limbo if the contract's done right.
Yeah, basically. If there's a problem with bankruptcy or something like that where the publisher's assets are going to somebody else, then you can get into a real tangle, and that's when books do disappear. But if the author was able to get the rights back, then they have the option they can resell them. Now, of course, you have ebooks, and it's easier for people to reprint ebooks themselves. It didn't used to be that way before ebooks. That's why you're seeing a lot of older works now go back into print as ebooks, because authors are able to do that, or are able to sell them to ebook publishers. But yeah, it just kind of depends on the situation, and some people get out of it luckier than others, basically.
I imagine media tie-in books are more stuck with the publisher or the company versus and the authors don't always get the rights to them versus your original works, right?
Yeah, basically since the actual world and characters and everything are owned by someone else, that's work for hire, and so you don't actually own the copyright to that book. You contract with them and you're paid for it and you get royalties and everything, but you don't own the copyright. So if it went out of print, I'm assuming it would return to the original rights holder who licensed it to the publisher and not to the author.
Okay. So this next one says, you've done a lot of media tie-in stuff. You've written in a lot of universes, written about other universes, like you did the Harry Potter one. You've written the Dark Gates and the Gods of Lovecraft. You've done Stargate Atlantis stuff. You've done Star Wars stuff. And they just want to know, are media tie-in things easier for authors to do since there's already such a world of research already done for them and they can just work into it? Or is it represent its own challenge when you dive into someone else's universe and you have to think like they do?
It is kind of challenging. I mean, it is easier that the world's already established, the world building's been done, and you have the characters you already know how to work with. The challenging part is to make your books really feel like part of that universe. If it's a TV show, I'd want to try to make my characters match the voices of the actors, and I want to try to get kind of feel for the stories they do, and I want to really feel like my work can fit into that universe and be as fun for the readers as that TV show is. With the Lovecraft story, I wasn't really trying to sound like Lovecraft or anything like that. I was mostly trying to bring it into that feel of there's been a lot of pastiches of the Lovecraft books. I was more trying to do that, is make a detective story using the Lovecraftian elements. So it's different for different things, but it can be a challenge, especially if you're trying to work with a property like Star Wars or Stargate Atlantis, where it's very popular and a lot of people know about it, and a lot of people have expectations of what it's going to be like, and you want to try to write a good book that says what you wanted to say, but you also want it to fit into the universe.
Is it a challenge, or especially challenging as an author, to write in a universe such as Stargate Atlantis or Star Wars, where stories are told in a 2-hour segment or sometimes even a single episode, and people are so visual in how they tell them, but you have to write a book which is usually considered to be longer, because a single episode book would be like 100 pages maybe. And is it challenging to transfer a visual medium into writing? Actually,
not really, because you get to tell a much more in-depth story than the show or the movie can tell in that space of time, and your special effects budget is unlimited. You don't have to worry about paying actors, so you can have whichever the characters you want. You can have the entire cast and all the recurring characters if you want involved, because you don't have to worry about the time limits and paying people and that kind of thing. So you can take that movie or that TV show and give it a much bigger canvas and go into all the plots and motivations of the characters, and you can have a lot more fun like that, I think. You're taking it into a different medium, and that kind of allows you to expand on it in some ways, in a way that they can't on the screen, basically.
Basically, you can make what would be impossible for the big screen to do just due to budgetary and realistic restrictions. You can make that possible, so people can have a fantastic adventure in a different way by reading your book, and therefore get a different experience.
Yes, basically.
You're one of the big female names in writing fantasy and science fiction, and you also write really strong female characters. When you're writing a female character, what is the key to making the female character A, strong, and B, believable and realistic without going full Mary Sue?
Well, you have to think of them as a person. If you can't write, you have to think of all your characters as real people with real needs and their own agendas and their own viewpoint and their own goals. And you do that with women just like you would do that with male characters. You really have to think of them as people. I think some people get in a difficulty where they think that do get judged more harshly, because I think there's a standard where a female character, she has to be perfect, she can't make mistakes, and yet she must be realistic and must be not a Mary Sue, and that kind of sets up an impossible standard to hit. And I think the best thing for authors to do is just write them as people. And don't be afraid to give female characters failings. Don't be afraid to have them make mistakes. Just treat them like you would any other main character or heroic character.
Like, sometimes people their goal is to make a strong female character, but they make them basically superhero, superpower, because they don't want to give them a flaw, because they think that'll make them, people think less of them. Or they give them too many flaws, and it also hurts.
Yeah, you feel like if you give someone a flaw, then suddenly they're not a strong woman anymore or whatever. And it's like, the characters are going to get angry. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to, do things wrong. And it's the recovery from that and the learning process that makes a person strong. And you have to give that to the female characters too.
And then at the same time, this is one that I believe I read about in one of your blogs concerning Raksura, where at the same, you also have females where they can use their sexuality in their books or even in movies and so on, but if they use it too much, they're considered, skanky, or they're considered, whorish, and if they don't use it all, they're considered prudish. But, you wrote about, I believe it was one of your recent blog entries about some of your characters in Raskura using their sexual relationships in the books, and how some people find that challenging.
It wasn't really that. It was the fact that the sexual relationships in the book, in the Raksura culture, are not easily mapped to human sexual relationships in our culture. That it's kind of a different thing, and so some people found that confusing. And also the gender-neutral names. That was mostly what people found confusing.
You get confused if it's male or female or how it works, because we're thinking on human terms, and when you create fantastical, you have to be able to think on the way your society works.
Yeah, basically.
But if I remember Raksura really well, you kept it so consistent that by the time it took a little, it takes a little bit to get into it at first because you have to delve into the world and be able to accept it. But once you get into it, it's the consistency that really keeps you there because no one breaks the rules that are there. No one suddenly becomes act like normal human on Earth just for the book. And as readers, we appreciate that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So this next question is about Razor's Edge, because that was one of the very last Legends novels, I guess is what we call it now. The very last one was, I believe, the sequel by James S.A. Covey, I guess they want to be called, Honor Among Thieves. But they just want to know, is it hard to write Princess Leia, especially in her voice, when there's not very much of Carrie Fisher to go by except in those movies? Is it hard to write a Carrie Fisher Leia without so much Carrie Fisher to model off of?
Yeah, it's a little difficult. I think that's always a problem, though, when you're writing media tie-in fiction for a movie or rather than a TV series. With a TV series, if you're lucky, you have, tons and tons of episodes to look at and really kind of, you can see the way the actor's performance changes over time. And with the movie, there's a lot more where you're just going to have to go by your own interpretation of the actor and what the way they're doing the part. And kind of, there's a lot more room in there, I think, for extrapolation and using your own imagination about what the character's thoughts and feelings would be and how they would change over time and that kind of thing. So yeah, it is really more work, I think.
And one thing which I read Razor's Edge recently, right after I watched Force Awakens, and you really captured the Carrie Fisher Leia, which they tried continuing pretty successfully in The Force Awakens. The Leia that is the general, the Leia that's in charge, the Leia that's still hurt from all these losses, but at the same time, she's not necessarily the one who'll settle down and do all these things. Did you see the Leia that you wrote in The Force Awakens? When I'm assuming you saw it, because most of the people in the world have seen it.
Yes, I did, and I really, really loved. I really loved the movie altogether, but I really loved her performance in it. I was really happy with that. I was happy with the whole movie. I enjoyed it a lot.
Is that the direction you saw when you were writing Razor's Edge? You would see the Leia from the original trilogy going after the movies rather than in the books. I guess there are so many books they had to do something, but like the Leia you wrote seemed to be really that Leia, and if they recanonized your book, it would seem to fit really well with those and with that movie.
Yeah, I mean that's what I kind of imagined. I imagined her and Han staying together. I didn't think that he would leave or they would break up because I kind of wanted that happily ever after ending. But yeah. Other than that, it was pretty much what I thought. What I'd imagined. So yeah, that was kind of cool.
Okay, so when it came to Razor's Edge, three of you were given novels to write about the three main characters that take place in the original trilogy, one of which, of course, Heir to the Jedi became one of the new canon novels, as Kevin Hearn had to, I imagine he had some severe edits to do after things changed. But did they tell you guys when to have your books take place in the original trilogy, or did you guys get to choose? And then also, how easy was it to map a story in between movies where we really don't know much of anything, even book-wise, that took place?
They told us about what time period that it was going to be between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, and I think originally we talked about doing it like right after A New Hope, and then decided to make it a little, I think it's about a year maybe. It's been so long I can't remember exactly, but to give them a little time to have the characters have a little more time together before the book, and have the rebellion have moved to a different base or in the process of moving to a different base. Okay, now what was the question again? I'm sorry.
That's funny.
Trying to remember when.
Yeah, well, you were saying how they got involved in the how you picked the time frame, and then how hard is it to write in an era between movies where really between episode 4 and 5 there's maybe three books that cover anything in that 3-year period. Was it hard to insert a story in there when there's really not much information that you could go off of?
Well, I was working with some of the guidebooks, which give kind of timelines of what the rebellion did during that time period. So that helped a lot. And also the Razor's Edge, it doesn't take place over a long period of time. It's basically maybe a few days, I think. So, you weren't having to come up with a lot of information about exactly what they were doing. You were just like picking one certain point in time and inserting a story in there. So it was a bit easier. I think if I had to cover like the whole 3 years or whatever, that would have been much more difficult.
Okay. And you've mentioned in other interviews that this is the era that you choose to write in above all others. Why would you choose to write in an era that's more of that we know a lot more about movie-wise and visually, and you know what Leia's supposed to be like, versus way later in the timeline where you could do almost anything you wanted, and some authors did?
I just find this era more exciting. It's not long after Han, Luke, and Leia had first all met, and they're all still kind of working on these their relationships and what's going on and the really big issues. And so it's just like it just seems a more fun and exciting time.
Okay. One last question about Razor's Edge. You captured the spirit of Leia mourning Alderaan, mourning all the loss really, really well. And this listener just wants to know, in a lot of your books, especially Razor's Edge, you capture the spirit of loss and mourning like none other. Where do you draw from to get that writing on the page where people can relate to it so well and at the same time stay true to the character?
Oh, well, I think you kind of have to draw from your own life and your own sense of empathy. But you also have to remember that you're not writing about yourself or your own experiences. You're writing about someone else. So you really have to use your imagination and think from that person's point of view.
And I'm assuming, since you're such a big fan of Leia, that going from her point of view was something that you really enjoyed to do, and you could capture it well.
Yeah, I try to avoid writing about characters in media tie-ins. I don't do media tie-ins, or I wouldn't consider doing a media tie-in unless I really love the source material and I really love the characters, and that just makes it all that much more easier to get into the characters' heads when you've thought about when you've thought a lot about them and their situation, and you're just really interested in them.
Okay. And I know, because we've had other people who do lots of media tie-ins, but they'll do basically almost anything that's thrown at them. I believe one of the interviews we had recently said, he did Hellboy, but he never read or heard of Hellboy before, so he's able to do the tie-in. But you're one of the ones that you'll do it if you feel like an attachment to the franchise, attachment to the characters, and you're drawn into it, versus here's money. Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, I like money and everything, but I just don't think I would do a good job if I wasn't already a fan of the show. Because like with Stargate Atlantis was really my first media tie-in, and I've been a Stargate SG-1 fan for a long time since we first got access to watching the show when it was on Showtime, and I watched Atlantis from the beginning. So I was a big fan, and when the opportunity came up, it was like, oh yeah, I definitely want to do this.
Okay.
So I just don't think I'd do a good job on something I wasn't attached to.
So yeah, you're one of the ones that will, unless you can do a good job, unless you're going to do the best job you can, you're not going to pick it up, because you have lots of other stuff. You're writing a lot of books one time. You're writing a lot of series, and you've written a lot, and you have a lot of fans and stuff that you like to keep in contact with. So this next question, I'm just really curious. You started in the 90s, and in the 90s, authors, if they get fan mail, you get it by letter. You might get an email later in the 90s. But now we're in an era where fans like to really connect with authors and the people that they support. Do you find a greater connection with fans via conventions, via the internet, social media, email, and so on? Does it help you with your writing? Does it help you know what they want, or does it hurt you in a way that rather than feeling like you can be yourself, you have more expectations from all these people that think that you should act like this? Does it help or hurt to have so much more connection with fans and people?
I think in a lot of ways it does help, because one of the big problems of being a writer when you don't have that kind of connection is you're just kind of throwing your stuff out there and you're not really sure does anybody like it? Are people interested in it? Because you kind of I tend to blanket assume that no one's heard of me and no one wants to read my books. So it does help to have people say they're happy about the next book, they're interested in it coming out, they're excited. And that does help. I've noticed I have a Patreon for little short Rexura stories. And it does help to have people make suggestions about what they want to see, because you're kind of like, well, I didn't realize they were interested in that aspect of the world or the characters or whatever. So it is kind of neat to see that. And I'm not as on social media as a lot of other writers are. I don't think I tend to not talk a lot about what's going on, because mostly I'm just working. So I could have the most boring Twitter in the world if I kept people apprised of what I was doing. It's like, okay, now I'm going to have a cup of tea, I'm going to go write some more, and now I'm cleaning the house, So I'm not out there that much, but I really do like seeing that connection with the readers, or feeling that connection with the readers. And I do like going to conventions and getting to talk to people in person. That can be a lot. You can have a lot more detailed conversation that way in person than you can online, I think.
So books that you've written have actually taken new directions, or at least added more details, because that's what listeners really wanted to hear or know more about, versus what you originally had intended because of the interaction?
Not really new directions, but more adding detail, that people were interested in hearing. To trying to think of ways to work what they wanted into the story. Because the story and the plot's the most important thing in telling that story. So, because the whole thing would fall apart without that. But yeah, I do try to look at what people want, and a lot of times it inspires, ideas in me when they say, well, I want to hear more about this character, and you think, well, how can I get that character in there more? Oh yeah, I could do this. So. Yeah, it does. It does help, I think.
So we're going to begin wrapping things up. We have a couple questions left. This reader says, you've written young adult fantasy, and we're in a world where young adult novels are everywhere, and they're being made into movies, they're being made into TV shows, and some of them are derided, some of them are praised. For you, what do you think is the key to writing an effective young adult fantasy novel that appeals to the young adults that will read them, and the parents that sometimes have to read them for them or take them to the movie for them? What is the appeal of a young adult novel that's well written? What draws people to those type of worlds?
Well, they're really good stories, and just in young adult work, there's a lot of variety in the type of stories they're telling. It's like any genre can be young adult, mystery, romance, thriller, suspense, science fiction, fantasy. So. And I think they're a lot more open to different things. So just the sheer scope of the storytelling that's in young adult work now, and just I don't know. I think that's mostly it. It just feels like it's a wide open genre, and that there's so much good work being done in it, and so much really really cutting edge kind of stuff that it's just a very fun genre to write in.
And do you think so many young adult novels are being adapted to the big screen and television because the more, we'll say, hardcore adult ones are a lot harder to adapt, like a Robert Jordan or like a Dark Tower or, Game of Thrones? They're so dense that you can't really put them on the big screen without making huge, painful cuts, while a young adult one, being that it's usually smaller and simpler, you can put the most of the story on the screen in a way that people will enjoy and not have to cut as much stuff out.
Yeah, well, the books are shorter, and there are very complex young adult books, but the ones that are being mostly grabbed for movie adaptations and TV show adaptations are kind of are usually the shorter books with just a very strong story. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily that they're young adult, even though it's a very, very popular genre. I think it's the fact that the books that are have a very sort of cinematic story, and it's much And yeah, it's not as complicated with the multi-character points of view and things. It's like a big fat fantasy series. As but yeah, I've gotten really off on a tangent.
Yeah, it's okay. Tangents are fine. We like the stories. We like the sidetracks, and yeah, that makes sense. It's I guess. Shorter.
Yeah, they're shorter. They're more usually focused on a smaller group of main characters. So I think that just makes them easier to film. Even though there are young adult books out there that are very complex and longer, those aren't the ones I think that are getting picked for these adaptations.
So this is the last listener question. This one, I've written several novels and put them up on Amazon, and I have an issue when I write a standalone novel that when I finish it, I want to make it no longer a standalone novel, and I can't just leave it alone. Do you have any hints or tips for people who want to write standalone novels and leave it alone, but have a hard time leaving those characters and leaving that world behind to move on to something else?
Well, you can always do like a standalone, use the same characters, but keep them all as standalone novels. That's a bit harder to do, I think, for yourself, because you sort of want to carry over as it happened from the previous book. But if you look at a lot of mystery series, they can be that each book can be read, complete in itself. They're not sequels or prequels to each other necessarily. The stories are standalone, even though you're familiar with the group of characters from the other books. Basically, you can do, like, if you look at mystery series, they have each book can be read by itself. You can start the series at any point and still pick up on what's going on, but they're the same characters, and they might have ongoing character issues or relationships from the previous books, but they can be enjoyed by themselves. It just enhances the whole thing if you read the whole series. So I think it is possible, and that's just a common problem for writers. Is once you put all this effort into creating a world and creating people that you like and having them do all these things in the book, you kind of want to go back to that world. So maybe it's really a feature, not a bug, to want to continue the book with a sequel or something.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I tend to ramble a lot. I'm sorry. I'm not really good for pithy interview comments. I think I kind of ramble when I talk. So.
Well, it's one reason why I also like to do pre-recorded interviews, because then I can edit it down, and sometimes when we're talking there's glitches or we stumble over our words. It just makes it better than. Yeah. I like it. It's fine. So this is the last one for me that I'm just curious of. You wrote a short story called I believe it's In Mech Age of Steel, which is a short collection about, mecha robots. I just want to know, where did you draw from to write something in that universe? Because I grew up reading like the Stackpole Battletech ones. I've watched animes, the Gundam animes. I watched movies like Pacific Rim. Where did you draw from for writing a short story in that type of science fiction universe?
Well, the idea of the anthology was they were all going to be different. I think it was going to be different takes on the idea of the giant robot. So I actually did more of a fantasy one. That book hasn't come out yet. It's going to be a Kickstarter coming up from Ragnarok Publications, coming up real soon. But I did a fantasy version, and I actually set it in the same world as the Raxura, but with different characters in another part of the world, kind of going out and discovering this thing. And so it was a lot of fun to do, and to kind of think about, okay, how would I do a fantasy version of the giant robot, trope? So it was just a lot of fun.
Good. I had a lot of fun reading it, and I honestly, if I read giant mecha robots and it's not a fun book and they take it way too seriously, I usually get bored. Which is why I like
I would think so. I mean, because those are stories. I mean, they're meant to be. You can only take it seriously, or it's just going to fall apart. It would be interesting, I guess, the hard science take on it, but mostly we're just going to watch a robot fight.
Yeah, and sometimes you want, say, I guess there's the Iron Giant and Evangelion style where they take it more psychological, and the rest of us just want to watch Pacific Rim and watch a ship being used to batter a monster, and we're good with it.
Yeah, basically, you can do a lot with it.
Okay, so I think this is the last question. This one we ask, and we have a request, but this is the last one we ask all our guests. We're gonna give you the soapbox to promote any books that you have coming out. You just mentioned one that's upcoming. Anything else that you have left that's going to be coming out soon, or just came out, or convention appearances that you have coming up? We're gonna give you the soapbox to promote away and hopefully get people to find you at all these events.
Okay. My next book is The Edge of Worlds. It's another Raxura novel that's coming out on April 5th. It's going to be in hardcover and ebook, and I'm really looking forward to that. There's going to be a sequel to it, The Harbors of the Sun, that will be coming out next year. My next event is actually a signing I'm doing with at Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, with J. Kathleen Chaney. She'll be signing her new book too, and that's on it's April 9th. And the store is online, and if you want signed books but you're like in another part of the country, you can order books through the store, and they'll get them signed and personalized for you at the signing, and then ship them to you. And then I think the next thing after that, I'll be at Comic Palooza in Houston, which is a great time. And I think that's about it. I do have Mech Age of Steel. I have a story in that, and that Kickstarter should be starting maybe sometime in the next month, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
But thank you very much for interviewing me.
Thank you. It's an honor. Trust me. I grew up in a house where my dad had, he recently died, and we got to go through all his books, but he probably at his peak had about 10,000 books in our little house.
Oh, wow.
And so, I grew up with books everywhere, and just being able to talk to all these authors that, I've seen their books most of my life. I've read a lot of their books. It's an honor to me, and I love to share your stories with all the listeners. It's why I do what I do.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad you do what you do, because it really does help us get the word out.
Thank you so much for allowing us to do that, because you're the one with the busy schedule who writes all these things and sends us to the worlds that we like, and I'm just glad you're able to take some time out of your schedule to let us share some of it with everyone. Well,
thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, and I will send this to you as soon as it's up, and I hope that you get to enjoy the rest of your day.